Once again, we caution you. These stories are definitely not for the timid soul. So we tell you calmly and very sincerely, if you frighten easily, turn off your radio now.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Bonus Material Podcast. We have reached our Lucky 13 podcast, and I'm Heather Buckley.
I'm Thom Carnell.
And I'm Langley West.
And welcome to this week's podcast. What we're going to discuss is the idea around narratives, narrative structures, experimental narratives, and what makes a good story. What originally started me thinking about this subject is a lot of posts around a movie that just came out on Netflix called A Strange Color of Embodies Tears. And it's a movie that's sort of a cross between having a narrative structure and being an experimental film. And a lot of people go, I wanted more story. And a lot of the audience on my end went, go incredibly experimental and tell your stories through a visual. And I know, Tom, you've had some discussions about a film that's trying to pull this off without story.
Well, the Strange Color of Your Body's Tears it's a giallo, essentially, correct? So I think that it's made by the same people who did a Mare. So right away, you're on board for sort of a Baba-esque ride. I think in some cases, it comes down to style over substance, as opposed to the opposite of substance over style. The film, again, visually arresting, but at the end of the day, do you come away with anything other than that was purdy?
Well, it would also, how is a story defined? To me, you can define a story almost like something like La Jetée or stuff that Stan Brakhage has done in experimental film, that a story can be told just through visuals, just through phantasmagoric imagery, because the intent is to be more immersive. And that is a form of storytelling.
I agree, but the thing is that a story ultimately has to go someplace. And it's not enough to be just a tone poem unless it's a short film, correct? But you get a 90-minute feature and it really doesn't have anything to say other than I can create a string of really cool images that are loosely based in some kind of what I propose as narrative. But at the end of the day, I think the filmmaker and the storyteller has to have something to say, right?
I think I feel much the same way about that as I do about abstract art, visual abstract art. I think if you can't tell a lucid narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end, you're not a storyteller. I'm not saying I don't like experimental film or that I don't like abstract art. I just think it's lazy a lot of times, and I think that it's just it's a collage as opposed to taking my hand and taking me to somewhere or giving me a signpost and saying, go that way.
Right. It's like my complaint about David Lynch, where I would say that if you can't dazzle him with brilliance, baffle him with bullshit. Where I know at the end of the day I can confuse my audience, and my audience, being smart people, will think, I don't get this, so it must be smart. But at the end of the day, you need something to say. Look at a film like The Fall, where Tarsem sings The Fall, which a lot of people talk about as being all style and no substance. But at the end of the day, there's still a story there. There's still a progression of a group of characters towards something, as opposed to just random, the Art Nouveau of the early '60s of like French cinema, where it was just people staring off into space and saying things that were all disjointed.
Why do you need story?
Well, I think because otherwise the filmmaker is trying to impart a sort of point of view, correct, or a perspective. And story is something that is a way to impart a lot of information. It's a spoonful of sugar, right? I can talk to you about friendship and about honor and about duty in the course of a war film because you're involved with, because it's action and there's stuff going on and visually it's stimulating, but it allows me to speak to other things.
When I watch movies like David Lynch, because I actually am a fan, which sort of makes sense where my point of view is coming from, I do spend time with movies like Lost Highway. I spent 2 years thinking about what that film is about, and it's apparently someone who committed a great act and in his own mind had to create his own personality to cope with it. And to sit there with those puzzles, and these films, I feel Lynch is not lazy. He sometimes doesn't pull it off, but a lot of his films, he's not lazy, and through disparate sort of parts, he's putting together clues which tell a story after the fact. I almost felt that way with Maps to the Stars, Cronenberg's new film, is that you're watching it and they're bringing up topics that are not necessarily... There's a traditional story there about this crazy girl. She comes back, she bothers her family in Hollywood, and there's crazy people in Hollywood. But topics are brought up, and those topics together, they sit and think about them in a more abstract narrative, makes me incredibly satisfied. That doesn't mean that I throw away something with wonderful traditional Hollywood plot structure like Jurassic Park or Raiders of the Lost Ark.
I agree. I mean, Lynch in particular, I generally really enjoy his films. I think that a lot of his detractors, I think a lot of them are being lazy. They're not thinking as much as they should, or they're not allowing the material to do its job, which in his case, I think, is to get you to think. I mean, look, originally stories were created to teach us something. You know, people made up a story to tell you about how to keep away from this particular animal because it's going to fucking eat you, or whatever survival thing it was that the storyteller was trying to impart on. And at some point, somewhere along the line, that switched over to it wasn't necessarily about learning something, although you still could, as much as it was to entertain you. You know, the little kid sitting by the fire is like, tell me that story, tell me that one again, because I had fun listening to it, or I had fun imagining myself in that particular thing. And I think that abstract storytelling or non-traditional storytelling doesn't do those things, and that it's there. I think it's there for a different... I guess I would not call it storytelling. I would call it painting, or I would call it listening to an ambient music. That type of filmmaking or that type of poetry, to me, is the same as those activities. It's not the same as following a story, following a character through an arc, and you know, what have you.
Well, I think I think that art, to paraphrase Blade Runner, is a test to provoke an emotional response. And while non-traditional storytelling can do that, I think that it's more focused with traditional storytelling, where at the end of the day, I walk away feeling, at least I can walk away feeling, oh, that was a story about friendship, or that was a story about betrayal, or what have you.
Now, there is thoughts in the experimental community that because narrative really comes from what Langley spoke about, sort of sitting next to the campfire, but its next iteration was theater. And a lot of theater, though incredibly experimental at a lot of points, is mostly about story and narrative, and that poured it into our structure of what film is. Now, some experimental filmmakers have felt that because we focus so much on narrative and story, we have limited the evolution of film. Because what we have lost is the experiment around the image and the experiment of playing with image itself, because if film is light, if film is visual, just the essence of that. When the story gets in the way, it gets less experimental. There's less evolution. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's two different things. I think you can use film to make a painting. You can use film to create a mood. You can use film to do the same thing that looking at abstract art or listening to experimental music does. I think you can use film the same way. I don't think that's the same as telling a story. I do think that I think that there are filmmakers who toy with and experiment the storytelling process itself. When you look at people who use nonlinear timelines, or even going somebody as commercial as Tarantino, where we have characters that are doing something, and then the next scene we see, it's back in time for those characters, or it may have jumped forward. That character may have died. It doesn't necessarily follow a linear storytelling path, but they're still experimenting with storytelling without going into the realm of the abstract.
And what is the impact of that you feel on the audience using that technique? Because I think what we're sort of talking about is, what are the different techniques out there? What are the impacts of those different techniques?
Well, I think there's always going to be fans of people, like there's in the dance world. There's Balanchine and there's Twilight Tharp. So there's always going to be fans of each who like their own stuff. I'm sorry. Say that question again.
Is that as we're talking about all these different, or the beginning of talking about all these different sort of narrative structures, so far we identified something that's nonlinear and experimental features, and something that's in between, like The Strange Color of One Embodies Tears, which is sort of playing in both courts, and Lynch's films, which are much more phantasmagoric, but you spend time sort of thinking about the film. The idea is, like, almost from a creator's standpoint, where it's almost like finding your voice, and how do those different voices impact an audience?
Well,
like if you're making something that's nonlinear, how does that impact the audience? When would you use a structure like that?
I think it's like the idea that you want to challenge the audience or whatever else. I don't know. I mean, everything I've ever worked on, I'm a big fan of this is what happened in the order it happened. I've never tried to play with narrative timelines, so I can't really speak to that. But I think in the audience, it can either intrigue them or confuse them to the point of them just bailing on your
See, I always
premise.
felt that at least the author of the piece, of the film, if they're very deliberate in their intent, which I believe people like Anger and Brakhage and Lynch are very focused and deliberate on what they want from their audience and what they're doing, it makes sense, other than just being confused because the work isn't put together in a very tailored way.
I just don't get that out of Lynch's stuff.
I think it depends on which Lynch you're talking about.
Well, I'm mostly thinking around sort of like Lost Highway and Blue Velvet has a much more clear narrative, but something like Inland Empire doesn't. But that's a full experimental feature, and I feel its only flaw is that I really can't get into Laura Dern as my lead. I've never really found her super charismatic in that part, and for me that was the great flaw. But being in an immersive piece, watching someone dreaming is something that's incredibly experimental to me, and you see that sort of idea in other films, like all of Ken Russell's canons, because he's a visionary filmmaker, but his visions exist within what I would consider not a traditional narrative, but definitely a narrative is there.
But even look at Fellini. Fellini was the same way, but he at least had a story to tell and a point to make.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask Tom, when you start writing something, how do you start with a story? Like, what is your technique, and
Well,
are you sort of like
I don't recommend this for anybody.
and how are you porting that over when you're looking at other people's stories? Is there sort of a parallelism there?
For me, I want to know that the person is trying to impart either a viewpoint or a perspective. For me, my thing is on the book I wrote, I wanted to talk about friendship, and I thought it would be really cool to justify applying martial arts to zombies. Other than that, for me, I'll be honest. If it makes me laugh, if I think about it and it makes me laugh, it's really a good chance that it's going to end up in something. But what I think is important is that at the end of the day, I have something. I hope I have something to say about either the structure or the verbiage or the language or thematically. Do I want to talk about friendship? Do I want to talk about betrayal? Do I want to talk about anguish? Do I want to talk about what is it that I want to talk about, and how can I frame that into a narrative that people will, again, spoonful of sugar. I mean, I wanted to talk about the love of a man for a woman, and I ended up doing that just recently with a piece that's going into Carpe Noctem 20 that has everything to do with it's all zombies and blah 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 blah. But within that framework, at the core is a voice that says, I want to talk about this. And it's not just moving pieces around, here's a bunch of characters and I'm going to move them around this sort of cinematic board game kind of a thing. And they're going to bounce off and things will happen and people will fuck each other and people will betray each other and people will kill each other. But at the end of the day, am I trying to say anything? I think that's the problem with most of television series. They want to they don't have a plan. They don't have anything. There's not a philosophy. And I think art without a philosophy can be a sort of empty endeavor.
I was going to back up for a second and one, going back to something that Tom said, that I agree with him. I think art should elicit some type of an emotional response, whether that's to piss you off, whether it's to make you happy, make you sad, whatever it is. And a lot of times experimental films leave me feeling nothing. I can appreciate the importance of them, or I can appreciate the work that's gone into them, but emotionally I feel nothing a lot of times. As to the non-narrative timeline and a little bit of experimental maneuvering within traditional storytelling, when you look at something like, even though it's gimmicky, when you look at something like Memento, personally, I love that. I think that's great. I think it makes me think more, so I'm not just a passive viewer, and I come away with an emotional response.
But I think a lot of those things come in the editing process. And correct me if I'm wrong. One of my favorite films that uses non-narrative structure is The Limey. But I know The Limey wasn't written that way. It was written as a straight narrative and then in post edited as a non-narrative structure.
Well, do you think that that fussing with the timeline, let's talk about Pulp Fiction, can take a mediocre film and make it seem better than it is?
Well,
no, I would say no, because I think a lot of the charm around Pulp Fiction is the casting, the dialogue. If you think about it, because we're very anthology obsessed in the marketplace, it's almost sort of your granddaddy of contemporary anthology films. It's sort of taking that structure, but it's kind of mixing it around a bit.
I just don't feel like at the end of that I would. I think it would be a mediocre crime drama at best if someone recut it together in a linear fashion.
Well,
I don't know if you could, because it's talking about different worlds that somehow overlap, but not necessarily overlap. It's not even a hero's journey. I really don't know how you would do that, because they almost overlap like a Venn diagram, but it's not a full story. And
Yeah.
what is Pulp Fiction about other than hanging out with very interesting, cool characters? I
Right.
feel that I learn nothing by watching Tarantino's films, but that doesn't mean that I don't enjoy him and like him as a filmmaker.
Well, I mean, Pulp Fiction is just what it says. It's a love letter to pulp crime drama.
Right.
Whether that take the form of True Detective magazine or the old film noir movies.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, sure, it's always going to be a mediocre crime film. It's the acting, the editing, the non-linear timeline, all those things I think are what elevated above what an average one of those might be.
Right on.
So, like, I know you were going to talk for a second, so you talked about Tom a little bit before that, about sort of traditional narrative structure and really what that means. Because I think a lot of people, like we mentioned, like, I will watch crazy experimental films like The Begotten, but that does not mean I do not have great love for what Spielberg did with Jaws. Or even old school stuff like King Kong.
Yeah.
What do I think?
Traditional? What do you think? When it comes to traditional narratives and sort of breaking that down, what does that mean, and what would, and again, impact on the audience? What kind of story makes sense telling it in a traditional way?
Well, I think at its most basic level, and this is, I mean, it's almost so basic that you don't even talk about it. In that a story has to have a 3-act structure. It doesn't have to have a 3-act structure, but a story needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You need to have something that starts you out on this adventure. You need to have something that happens during it, the confrontation, and then you need to have some type of a resolution. Something that I hear more and more from critics and fans alike is this quote: "It was great up until the 3rd act." I hear that probably more about movies.
Look at every single Stephen King novel. Great up until the 3rd act, and then it all falls apart.
And so I wanted to talk. I mean, since we're talking about traditional structure, and like I say, at its most basic level, I think it's a beginning, a middle, and an end. What the fuck's up with the 3rd act? Why are people getting it wrong, or are we wrong?
I have an idea when it comes to genre films. It seems like our 3rd act in a traditional structure, there is not this spectacular face-off between the villain. Over and over movies that I have seen, the villain is dispatched in 3 minutes. He's not given our glory. We're not given our excitement. We're not getting the Ark of the Covenant open up with ghosts and like Nazis melting. We're not giving the spectacle before the denouement. And I think for me, that's one reason why a 3rd act is lacking, because you're building really to nothing. You're building to the hero winning very quickly, denouement, credits with really cool after effects.
Well, I think it's like it's easy for writers to paint themselves into the corner, because your first act is, let me introduce you to everybody, right? It's like, here's all of our characters, here's our setting, here's basically the introduction to the world. 2nd act's going to be all conflict, so it's like, that's fun too. But ultimately, when the writer, you can almost tell in most modern film where they realize, oh shit, we're at the hour mark, we're at the hour 15 mark, or what have you, we got to get out of this. And they start wrapping stuff up. And that's where you see the giant leaps of logic and the weird MacGuffin that comes out of nowhere that just saves the day. And they just wrap stuff up all too hurriedly, because at the end of the day, it was never about what happens in the denouement. It was all about the cool rocket and robot fight, and that happened at the centerpiece of the movie.
Would you agree with me or disagree with me that I think that most people, when they're coming up with a story, whether it's for a novel or a film or comic book or whatever, that they come up with the ending first, or at least once you've like, oh, I got this cool character in my head, then the next thing you should do is What's the ending?
Well, I think what happens a lot is correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like most pitches, they want to know what the premise is.
Right.
They don't want to know how does it end.
Right.
They don't want to know what are you trying to say, or what thematically. What they want to know is what's the world, what happens, what can I expect. So I think the business itself, even in the synopsis you read in the back of the book, it's all designed to get imparting the premise. And again, I read so many things that you can tell where the writer goes, "Oh, I gotta go." Look at the first volume in The Strain that Guillermo del Toro and what's his name?
Chuck Hogan.
Chuck Hogan did. There's a point about 2/3 in the end of that book where it's like, all right, the old Dave Chappelle thing. Wrap it up, B. You got about 100 pages, 150 pages to wrap all this shit up, and things just start happening that are, to call them wild coincidences is not even remotely fair. So I don't think they pay attention to how to get out of there until they're already in it, and then they come up with some harebrained thing, and most audiences will swallow it.
That's the problem with so many series.
Yeah.
So many television shows is that, we've got this great idea. It's, cheerleaders, in a biker gang of cheerleaders. Okay, cool. And, you go on and then we discover their adventures and they get into these different towns and all these different things happen behind the scenes and stuff. And nobody really knows where the hell it's going.
Right.
And then at some point, either it gets canceled and there's no resolution.
One episode wrap up.
Or,
look at X-Files, not to pick on Chris Carter and X-Files, but X-Files, the whole time Chris Carter said, I have a plan. I have a plan. But
bullshit.
Then throughout its narrative, you start seeing stuff like, contradictions that, like, why is it happening in this episode, but it doesn't happen in that episode? And you realize that he doesn't have a plan, that he's making it up completely as he goes along. Because again, I'm not going to pick on Walking Dead because we're going to talk about that. Lost. That was a series that was obviously being made up as it went along, despite what anyone said and despite comparisons to The Stand of all things.
I know
which the creators were making. That's ridiculous.
Well, the flaw in there is the world building,
right?
And theme.
But that's all it is world building, and there's no ramification. Again, what are you trying to say? What are you trying to accomplish? Now that you've built this world and you've set these people loose in it, what the fuck are you trying to impart to the audience? What do you want the audience to take away? It shouldn't be just he was a cool vampire and I like to fuck him, which seems to be True Blood in a nutshell.
You're dark for me.
Yeah.
Everybody's got their own favorite vampire that they'd like to fuck.
I don't know that I do.
Let's make a T-shirt of that. So these screenwriters who listen to the podcast, and I've worked on pitch material before, and you're 100% right. You need to have your log line, you need to have your synopsis, you need to have your characters, but nowhere are you really talking about the film conceptually, because
right.
That's a very broad thing for finance people to understand and maybe producers to understand that this film is about X.
Well,
they want to know solidly, literally, what point A, B, C, etc. The path.
I literally had with my book, I had to take it and reduce 160,000 words to a real quick phrase. And not only is that not fair, I mean it imparts the premise and imparts blah 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 blah. But how do you do that without just reducing everything down to just its most base? And if they buy that, then usually what ends up happening as you start adding, okay, well here's where the real bit of it. Oh, now suddenly it's complicated and blah 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 blah. I don't think a lot of filmmakers, they're really great visually, but storytelling can be a bitch. And I think it's heavy lifting, and not a lot of people understand it.
So what are the heavy lifting aspects of storytelling? Because it is very hard.
For me, it's just keeping track of everything. I mean, because you have to realize that it all happens in a real world. So, and the audience that you're telling your story to is completely blind. So you have to paint everything and not just gloss over shit. It's the classic first year writer thing about how a guy comes home and he throws his keys down and he picks up the paper and he picks up this and he goes and gets a drink and he goes and gets a sandwich and then he goes and flips on the TV and at no point has he put down anything. You know what I mean? So now he's just a guy walking around his apartment with an armful of bullshit. So it's that kind of stuff, just keeping track of it all. It's a lot of plates to keep spinning, especially if you're working on that classic A thread, B thread, C thread of as far as subplots go.
That's my hardest. The hardest thing for me is creating a big enough world. Like, I think I'm good at telling you this person's story, but I'm not very good at, and what's real ditch digging for me is coming up with a backstory for Frank, who lives down the road and runs the local it's a lure shop and a adult novelty store.
It's like the utilitarian shit it's the real nuts and boltsy
Right.
parts of writing as opposed to the fun stuff. For me, writing fight scenes is super fun. So that comes off easy. It's that whole two people in a hallway just sort of talking about small talk that doesn't really move the plot forward, but it has to happen in order to create time somewhere else on the timeline, for example. That stuff is just, it's like being dragged over glass.
What are techniques in traditional storytelling that moves a character forward?
Well, I think talking, as opposed to, corporal exposition that shows up, and you get that sort of weird Big Trouble in Little China dialogue where it's like, David Lopan, you mean David Lopan, the biggest crime dealer in all of China?
That's one of my favorite things about that movie. It's like every time somebody's introduced, they like...
Well, it's almost like old comic book writing.
Right.
I had to read, like, Silver Age comic books, and they're going, like, Thunder Lad, he does this, and every time you read about Thunder Lad, he's always announcing who he is.
Well, that was a Stan Lee thing. He used to say that every comic book is someone's first comic book, so we gotta speak at that level. It's like,
I think that whole thing of, like, so-and-so the Invincible, so-and-so the Incredible, so-and-so, I think partly comes from that.
Yeah, you sign on, you know what you're getting.
So something like in Big Trouble in Little China. So there's exposition there. How would you sort of attack that scene where you wouldn't have exposition? Because I've noticed, especially in genre, and to use a phrase that my friend Dixie came up with, that you go on the exposition roller coaster, where you put your hands up in the air. It's like, woo! Yeah. Exposition, which I think is one of the laziest forms of writing. For me, that's unforgivable in a narrative or a plot.
I think it's different for writing than it is for filmmaking.
Mm-hmm.
In filmmaking, I guess it's the same with writing too. In filmmaking, it's important to show and not tell.
Agreed.
As much as you can. So, rather than saying how would I attack that scene, I'll give you an example. The only movie that Bruce Lee lived to direct before he died was Way of the Dragon. There's a scene in there where this minor character is trying to explain to his boss why they all got their asses beat against one guy, and the guy's like, one guy? He's like, yeah, but he knows kung fu, and the mob boss is like, kung fu? Like, what the fuck is that? Cut to a shot of Bruce Lee working out, rather than having somebody explain what kung fu is.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we all know what kung fu is. Everybody does. But that's an example of being able to go quickly, directly, and economically from a concept that could have, like Herman Melville in Moby Dick, where he's like takes time out to give us a whole chapter about whales.
Yeah.
Because we don't know what whales are. Could have gone that way, but instead we cut to, boom, Bruce Lee working out. We know exactly what.
Yeah.
Why we know exactly why these guys got their asses beat.
Well, I think with books you've got a little more room breathing room, that you get those opportunities, right? That you can go off on a 1-page, 2-page,
Sure.
3-page chapter to go, oh, this is what, let me tell you a little bit about this minor plot point. And you can that film, every minute is money, so I think it's a different kind of thing. But there are better ways, and those, in my opinion, that's usually just set your two characters to talking. And you can impart the same or imply the same, without having to sort of take your audience by the hand, like as if they were a child, and go, okay, here's this guy and here's this guy. They're smart people, sometimes too smart. Look at the fans' reaction to True Detective. I mean, I was out making up shit out of nowhere, and it turns out that the reality was so much simpler.
I think that, like for example, if you're setting up a character, you could have somebody like in Guardians of the Galaxy reading their rap sheet, right?
Right.
Or you could have somebody saying, yeah, so-and-so, he's an asshole. Rather than that, show me so-and-so doing something asshole-ish,
Right.
That's, give me a scene where this guy treats somebody like a dick.
Well, especially with film, that you can take that 10-second, 20-second drop in of the guy
Right.
being a dick, and then cut back to your narrative, and it isn't even a bump in the road.
Right, and we automatically know who this guy is. And we have the added bonus that he may not be like that, and that this was just a misdirection all along.
Right.
What is our thoughts on voiceover in narrative film?
Depending on it.
Because I was just watching I Stand Alone, which is a very pleasant film. I think it works very well in it. I also think it works very well in Goodfellas. It does not work very well in Casino.
Or Blade Runner.
I would agree, but there are people on both sides of that debate.
Oh, I'm sure there is. The problem with the voiceover in Blade Runner is that it assumes the audience isn't smart enough to pick up stuff. It's the visual cues.
In Blade Runner, you have this classic. When you watch the version with the voiceover, we have Frank Darabont speaks to this. You have this beautiful scene going on between him and I'm sorry, what's the
Pris?
No. At the very end, the Tears in the Rain.
Rutger Hauer.
Yes, the Tears in the Rain sequence. Okay, beautiful, right? We get it, or we should get it, and then if you watch the version with the voiceover, you have this. I don't know why he said. It's like, oh my god, it's the worst, right? It's like, not only that, but Harrison Ford sounds like he's just had it at that point.
But on the other hand, there are points of the narrative or the voiceover that work. The idea of, as soon as you hear him say sushi, that's what my ex-wife called me. Immediately you get called to mind all the Philip Marlowe's, all the.
Right, and I think that's the only reason the voiceover was there to begin with, was to draw that parallel.
If you ever read, highly recommended Paul Salmon's book, Future Noir on Blade Runner, talks a lot about what a troubled shoot that was and how everyone hated each other. If you watch the makeout scene between Sean Young and Harrison Ford, there's a lot of anger there. There's a lot of anger there.
I also highly recommend watching Dangerous Days, which is the filmic version of that particular book. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the voiceover in something like Goodfellas, which I feel is almost a musical element to the film? Martin Scorsese's films being very musical to begin with, and I don't even mean their soundtrack or score.
Right, no, I think it adds to it. In that case, the voiceover adds to it because it immediately ingratiates you with one character, and you sort of sign on, and it's easier to buckle up for the ride. In that case, I think it works. But it can not work in other situations, and it's horrific.
I think when the voiceover works, it's because it's like it's like a patina that you're putting on something. It's like will it work without it?
Well, imagine Fincher's Fight Club without the narrative or without
Sure.
the voiceover. It would.
That's a great example of a voiceover that works really well.
In some ways, I think it carries the film. So,
Yeah.
but I don't know. I think that the problem now is that I heard someone say that people stopped making films and started. I mean, the goal is a franchise, right? For the most part, they want.
Franchises still have stories. I mean, one of the points that I made when writing about the Jodorowsky Dune doc is that he wanted this incredibly long-form science fiction film, and that exists on TV.
Mm-hmm.
It exists on HBO. The Lord of the Rings films with all the extra footage, I think, is a 12-hour-long film.
Ugh.
So we do have room for story in our franchises.
Yeah, but you know what the thing is like Lord of the Rings is a great example. It's a film that allowed an audience or showed that an audience will strap in for a really long time. The problem, in my opinion, is to paraphrase someone I heard say that it's a 12-hour film about walking. I mean, when I watch a film, the most common complaint I have is it could have been trimmed up. We could have tightened this up. Unless you're on board, unless you sign on for something like Kurosawa or Terrence Malick film, then you're in for a long ride. But for the most part, when I walk away from most American films, I think we could have lost 10, 15 minutes of runtime on that easy.
Well, 90 minutes came out of sort of the show times at normal theaters. Do you feel that the 90-minute mark is the way to go? A lot of genre filmmakers still sort of go by that mark.
There needs to be, in my opinion, there needs to be a really good reason for a 2.5, 3 hour film.
And that is?
That your story is so broad that it warrants it. But how many films have you seen, especially lately? What did I just watch?
But a lot of people talk about they feel like if they're spending like $12 a ticket, they want something more epic, even though the story doesn't seem so epic.
But that's just padding.
I loved Pacific Rim. I think that was definitely a movie that was over 90 minutes, but it was 2 hours of spectacle.
There's no reason that Captain America, the Winter Soldier, was 2 hours and 15 or whatever the fuck it was.
What would you have removed?
Oh, a lot.
I have not seen it. I was told by one of my close friends that I should at least check it out.
My problem with Captain America was that it destroyed. You've spent all these films establishing S.H.I.E.L.D. and Captain America pretty much just wipes it off the game board, and I think that's ridiculous. You spend the time building something, let it play for a while. You've got a lot of films in you, and that S.H.I.E.L.D. can go on for a really long time, and you can tell all of those stories. But instead, it's more visually exciting to see it torn down. But I just don't think, no matter what the Captain America story is that you're trying to tell, I just don't think you need 2.5 hours to tell it.
I think it depends on the story. I think this is you have story X, and if it takes 5 minutes to tell story X, then you do it for 5 minutes. If it takes 3 hours to tell story X, then you do that for 3 hours. I think it just depends on the story. I think Tom's right. I think a lot of times they're taking basically a Saturday Night Live skit and trying to turn it into a 2-hour movie.
There's no reason there that this last Hunger Games needs to be two separate
movies.
films.
Right.
A total of almost, 4.5 hours of runtime.
That was a comment around The Hobbit.
Yeah, The Hobbit too.
Source material can't sustain it.
The original was a pamphlet at best.
Right.
And you're pulling 3-hour films out of it. I don't care. There's padding. There's padding in there, and I don't know that it's necessary.
What does padding mean to the audience? Because I think one thing we were talking about is sort of narrative that makes a point, narrative that's time length to sort of sustains the world vision and epic of his film, reasons to use voiceover and not use voiceover.
Well, I think if you it goes back to what you're saying about world building. If you like the world, like when my daughter was younger, she would have sat still for a 90-hour Harry Potter movie just because she loved being a part of it. And I mean, that's part of the movie going experience, but at the end of the day, what are you trying to say?
Yeah, I think it's two different things. There's the fan experience, where if you're a Middle Earth fan, then you're going to be there for, the 6 hour, whatever it might be. But I think that if you're just talking about basic bare storytelling, generally shorter is better.
I think a long-term narrative that did it right. It's actually Breaking Bad, which everybody discusses, of course, and knows the series. But I felt, except for maybe a half of one series, everything was used. Nothing was wasted. It actually was conceptual on top of that and told the full story of this guy's life and did not get sentimental at the end. I think it's a very powerful ending.
Yeah.
And it had strong characters, but also a strong story and also plot. It had both that we were following throughout the seasons.
But how many of those things didn't go that way? Look at the way 6 Feet Under came undone. Look at the way Lost came undone. Look at the way Walking Dead now is just an unfocused mess.
I think that stems from just going too long. It's like not knowing. Here's our ending point, and okay, we're in season 3 or 4, whatever it is. Where are we at in relation to our ending point?
Well, look at like Dead Set. Was it Dead Set? In on the BBC, the zombie thing. The dead. I think it's Dead Set. Anyway, 6 episodes. You're in. You're out. You're done. And we can walk away and go to something else. The problem is with American television, especially American television, is that you get something that works and you want to keep pulling the lever and you want to keep getting the treat. But as a friend of mine says, serialization leads to trivialization, and sooner or later, like in the case of Lost, you've thrown so much stuff out onto the game board that now to try to explain it all, you end up pulling rabbits out of a hat and silliness out of your ass.
I think that's why I think in general the BBC gets it right, because a lot, even if their stuff is an ongoing series, you get it in short punches. Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay, we tell this story, or like, for example, something like Sherlock, where one season is like 2-hour movies that tell this story. Boom, that story's done. Now we go to a different story, or.
But a lot of American television is just about, okay, so next week, once we've satisfied the promise we made last week, now it's about making a promise for next week because, man, we want you to keep tuning in. And it's, so I think storytelling takes this sort of back seat to the commerce of selling soap, as they used to say about soap operas.
And a lot of the series aren't episodic anymore. I know I used to love Scrubs because Scrubs is very episodic. It's in and it's out, and whatever the hour it is. So is The Simpsons. So you don't need that longevity and those great ideas. Now, when I watched Deadwood, I felt Deadwood's story was weaker, and you could tune in any time and enjoy Deadwood because there wasn't sort of this continuation of a very strong narrative. It seems story-based and character-based. So what is our thoughts sort of in that direction? Because for me, it was hanging out in that world and hanging out with those characters and listening to the language, which made it much more engaging for me.
Wow.
Well, I agree with you. I think it's much more satisfying when you have an episodic series, something like Kolchak, Night Stalker, where each episode is a different story. We have the connectors, he works at this newspaper, this guy's his boss, this guy's always doing this, but each one is a different story. I think that that gets difficult after a while because you start running out of stories that can fit in that little.
And it goes into the whole Die Hard thing about how many times can this happen to a guy?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But I also think that there are things that go that continue that you kind of okay, it's like if I just look at the story itself, it's not that great, but I love this characterization of this, I love this actor as this guy, or I love, what's one of the biggest television series on television right now other than The Walking Dead? The Big Bang Theory, right?
Yeah, that's all about visiting
these characters, right?
Yeah.
Exactly, and I think successful sitcoms are that way. It's you want to go and you want to hang out with these characters,
sure,
because they've all done the same stories. They've all done the same stories that Lucy did, and I Love Lucy. It's a formula that's always there. But because the characters are so engaging, you go.
There's also the idea, since we're on characters, I'm very much in love with films like Taxi Driver, which in a traditional sense, and I don't know if they use the term anymore, is a feminine narrative as opposed to a masculine narrative, because it's a circular narrative where the character is driving plot. The plot is not driving character. And I feel that I'm much more attracted to stories that are about world building, that are about character, about a character moving through time. And I know when Martin Scorsese has talked about his pictures, he's always said it's like that's sort of the narrative that he's attracted to. People who are moving through space and not moving through space because we're trying to tell a story.
I'm going to let you go on this first.
Okay, I was just going to say, well, I get that, the one thing that you have to have whenever you do something like that is you have to have a really strong, engaging character like Travis Bickle. Without that, then I think that's when you run the risk of it just becomes boring. It's like, why am I watching this guy? I haven't seen Boyhood yet, but I need to have a really good reason to watch this kid grow up. You know what I mean? I mean, I know the movie's not 12 years long, right, but it's still, I need to have a reason to watch somebody go from a little kid to however old they become. I think another movie like that would be Citizen Kane, where we have this very strong, engaging character in Charles Foster Kane being played by a very strong, engaging person in real life, in Orson Welles. And I don't think it's so much about the plot as much as it is him. He's driving the plot. He's the reason why this happens, and then this happens, and this happens. None of those things would happen without him. And sure, I like that type of a story. You just got to make sure that it's a really strong character.
Well,
And something There Will Be Blood, I think, also falls into that category. Watching that character.
Right.
Are you guys a fan of that film?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that movie. Yeah.
I think for me, it's like everything drives the plot forward. Everything tells me something about the world that I didn't already know. From why the guy is wearing Oxfords as opposed to hiking boots. Why does he smoke that cigarette? Why every single thing that you introduce in the world should tell you something either about the character that's using it or something about the world, or that it's limitations of the world, or what have you. Because again, your audience is blind, and you're sort of spoon feeding them information. Conversely, I think that if you introduce something, there needs to be, since there should have been a reason for it, there needs to be a reason for it to be there. There needs to be, it needs to appear someplace else. If it doesn't, then
like
it should.
Chekhov said.
Say again?
Like Chekhov said, he said if you're going to use the, I believe, gun in scene 3, it has to be in scene 1.
Yeah, if you show the gun in the drawer, it better fucking show up. Or it can, that in and of itself can be something that you want to say something about your character, like he's the kind of guy that keeps a loaded gun in a desk drawer. then it is introduced and it serves its purpose. But a lot of times you just get these cool things that happen and this stuff that sort of looks cool on screen, and then you never see it again. But I personally put a lot of thought into everything. I hate to go back to the old creative writing book one character sheets, but I want to know, at least on an instinctive level, what my main character, what kind of food does he like, because it could come up in the course of the narrative. I need to know, I like to think like, okay, this guy is a classic rock guy, or this guy is a sort of hipster, or whatever. And then as you start to tell your story and push people through the funnel that is your story, you're dropping these hints, as opposed to, hey, Phil, I know you like modern rock, or whatever. As opposed to that Captain Exposition thing again. You can show it just by more and more about the character, about the cut of his coat, the way he handles himself, how he addresses women differently than how he addresses men. It's all that stuff. It's not just enough to get this cardboard character, pull his string, and let him loose into a scene, because that just doesn't work unless you're doing something like Conan, who is a constant.
Absolutely. That brings up something I wanted to say. There's a lot of rules, right? There's a lot of rules to storytelling, just as there is to everything else. And like everything else, rules are meant to be broken. Tom and I were talking about this the other day. But in order for you to be able to break a rule, you have to know the rule. So if you're going to do something that breaks a rule of storytelling, then you need to know how to tell a story first. If you're going to be Picasso, right, and go into Cubism, you need to be Picasso when he was a traditional artist and knew how to paint, right, and could paint realistically.
How many people do you see that just don't do that? They just go, what, I can just skip over this.
Exactly.
Well, because I think the idea from my design training, because a lot of my professors spoke to that, is that the rules so you could deliberately break them, and so your audience knows that you're in a space where they're deliberately broken. Mm-hmm. Because the idea in design or in visual art is that if it's slightly off center, it looks wrong to the human eye. Right. But it's very off center, it looks like a deliberate mark. And a lot of times when I review films, it's about what are we trying to achieve by your movie, and were they able to do it in a deliberate and clear way? Or, again, like with the idea, if we go back to Lynch, he deliberately doesn't want to do that, and I can see that in his work. Mm-hmm. It's not something that's just sort of spectacle and I leave the theater, which is a lot of, you hear that from a lot of the audience members. It's like they have exciting and fun when they watch the film, but when they leave it, they go, what did I just watch?
Well, have you ever sat through like viewings of like Herschel Gordon Lewis movies? And you'll hear people in the audience talk and over-intellectualize it about his choice of shots and about his construction within the scene. And you know that none of that happened, right? You know that it was just some guy with a camera just shooting from the hip. But, there you are, and you're hearing all of this like, oh, well...
It could be there subconsciously. There are stories of Anthony Burgess. They were talking about Clockwork Orange, his novel. They didn't know he was in the audience, and he actually stood up and said, really? I didn't even think about that in my book, but it exists there. Jodorowsky's the same way. Mm-hmm. I've seen him speak twice, and he said anyone that ever comes up to him that sees anything in his work, he goes, yes. And I have to say, as someone who's a writer and a visual artist, anything they see in my visual work, it's owned by the audience. It completely is there, even though I didn't put it there. But when it comes to writing and narrative work, I try to nail down my message as much as possible. And that's sort of what the idea of the deconstructive movement is about, because the term is always used wrong, is that if the author is not around, does the narrative stand on itself? And what is unraveling and what doesn't make sense?
Well, once the artist, I think we've talked about this before, but in my opinion, once the artist releases his work out in the world, he's done. it's up to the world to interpret it, whether for good or for bad, or whether it's brilliant, or all of the subtext they're going to find. That has nothing to do with the creative person. There are things that, for example, I try to put into the shit I do, but 9 times out of 10, either it's a stupid joke or it's just something that just gets missed by the audience, and then you wait, and then there's that one guy that walks up and goes, "Hey, did you mean to do this?" And you go, "Yeah, fucking A, I did," and kudos to you for catching it.
Because nobody else did.
Because no one else did. I mean, in my book, I mentioned that a funeral home is called the Howard Fine and Howard Funeral Home, and not one of you fuckers have come up and said, "That's the Three Stooges." So there.
Other than in-depth character development, what are details that you feel that people miss in cinema or when they're developing a narrative? Because a lot of times we have 3 acts and we haven't really talked about things that are beyond 3 acts or things that don't really have acts and what those structures look like and what those movies are. It seems to be a lot more character-driven films, because I'm thinking about films like Happiness or Paul Wes Anderson films. There's not really a lot of the postmodern films. The characters don't really have arcs anymore.
Right.
And that's gone, which is fine depending on what kind of film you're making.
Well, yeah, but I mean, there's very little character arc for Mark Wahlberg in Transformers 4, because I don't think those kind of films are about that. I mean, even in a film like The Avengers, there's minor movement to the left or the right of the character, but there's no, it's not about that. It's about spectacle. It's about blowing shit up.
Yeah, and to me, a lot of characters don't go through an arc. A lot of things aren't necessarily set up as 3 acts. In my opinion, this is why I think storytelling, especially in film, is essentially sucky. I mean, it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And, people call me an old fuddy-duddy, and I'm not hip to the kids. I've said this several times. I don't give a fuck what the kids want. They don't know what they want yet.
I think people are programmed to like what is being
fed to them. Yeah, exactly. I was thinking about this the other day. When you look at a history of film, you can look at all these iconic moments, whether it's an iconic speech like in Network, right? Mm-hmm. Or whether it's an iconic image, or just a sequence, right? Where immediately, whenever you reference that, everyone knows what you're talking about, even if they haven't seen the film.
Sure.
In my opinion, in the last, 10 years, 15, maybe more, there's less and less of that. Is there a movie that... part of this probably isn't storytelling, though. Part of this is probably the way that we get our media today, and that we're just we're overstimulated by everything. We have constant images and stories and things being thrown at us continually all the time. So I think things have less of an impact. But I also think that it is partly because there's just weaker storytelling going on. I don't see the movie or the story that latches a hold of me as a kid and makes me change my life. I don't see that shit now.
And I wonder about that, because a lot of writers, both in fiction and in film, they write based off of what they've seen. It used to be that a screenwriter was a guy who went out and did things, and then he would come back and it was just like a regular writer. But now it's all about finishing the script, going on to the next one, and there's very little time for that life. You know what I mean? So it's like, it becomes, I see it in a lot of modern film, I see it being copies of a copy of a copy. It's like, I'm making a film based on, not off of personal experience, but off of this handful of films that I'm sort of pulling from and using as a filter to run this particular script through.
Right. Like even when you dealt with an author who wrote as simplistically as somebody like Edgar Rice Burroughs. I mean, the guy had gone through, job after job after job. He was a failure at all these jobs, but because of that, he had this wide
Right.
path of experience to draw from. Or you do something like Hemingway, where you intentionally go or even better. Gosh, I can't remember his name now. He would do all these sports things, and he'd get in the ring with somebody and get beat up, and then he'd write about boxing. What the heck was his name?
I don't know. There's a guy named Sam Sheridan. There's a book called The Fighter's Heart.
Well, it's not him. I'm thinking late '60s, but I'll think of it.
George Plimpton.
There you go. Thank you, George Plimpton.
Yeah.
Where you intentionally sought out these experiences so that you could write about them, so that you weren't talking out of your ass.
Yeah, as opposed to now, where I think that screenwriters get brought on board for films that they've already been greenlit. Everything's on its way. It's already cleared. Sort of that screening of focus groups or whatever. And other than independent film, which is really where people are doing what they want, and all the fresh voices are coming from, or films that are made outside of the U.S.
As you're observing life as an artist, all right, because these guys, as we've discussed, are sort of watching TV, watching movies, watching things that are from the past and cannibalizing them. When they're not really going out into the world, is our assumption, and absorbing reality. What are details that you guys pay attention to? Because I know that I'm always people watching about how people stand, how people speak, crazy shit that happens in the park. I based one story again, a drug dealer, which a bunch of gay guys in the park, and them yelling at each other, and the park was filled with pigeons. It's like trying to keep a running tally of that in my brain. I had a creative director once. He was a male, and he just said, girls are the best fun. He was a very flamboyant himself, and I just thought that would be great to create a character that has a T-shirt like that on him. So it's like all these details that I put together that create worlds that I write about, but they're not coming from film. So what should young artists or older artists look at out in the world?
I'm really lucky in that I work I have a regular job that I work in healthcare. So I get a parade of people that just come through. And so as far as character selection, it's real easy just to roll through the Rolodex of patients that I've had in the last 15 years or whatever, and go, oh, that guy or that attribute or what have you. But I think inspiration is everywhere. I wrote a story once based solely on the idea of I was just putting my daughter, who was really young, I was putting her to bed. And I thought to myself, how odd would this be if I were like a ghost instead of who I am? And it became this little thing about a dad who had died and put his daughter to bed every day, and despite being dead. Had I sat down and said, I want to talk about fatherhood, I never would have come up with that. But in the moment, it's being aware enough to go, hey, here's my in. Here's that enough daylight that I can broach the topic and break it open and tell a story that I think that will resonate with people.
I think it's as basic as nuts and bolts as doing something like keeping that journal, keeping that pocket. Every time you think of something, you see something, you hear a snippet of conversation that your Geiger counter goes off, and you go, ooh, write that shit down.
Yeah.
You may not mean anything to you later, but you've got this list of nuggets, list of things, and sometimes those things will trigger the best ideas.
Ray Bradbury used to say that if you ever come up with a little phrase or whatever, just write it on a 3x5 card, stick it in a little card catalog, and then when you're stuck for ideas, just flip through it. It also depends, I think, on what kind of writing we're talking about. If you're talking about film writing, you don't really have to be and I'm going to get letters, I'm sure, from screenwriters, but as adept with the language, where you don't need to be a Clive Barker or a Joe R. Lansdale or someone that uses, or Neil Gaiman, who uses words beautifully, because screenwriting is not about that. In fact, it's about completely the opposite of that.
Right.
Well, a lot of it's based on casting, and I know when I work with people on screenplays, they go, remember, someone's going to add their own language, pace, their look and feel, how they're lit, which is going to sell it in a different way than just this flat dialogue on the page. When you're doing something that's straight prose, you just have the straight prose on the page.
Well, as a writer of prose, I know that I can control the pacing of what's going on. I can control how the person moves through the room. Well, that comes out of I can write a beautiful monologue and work and slave over how every single phrase links to every single word and every word links to every phrase. And then 6 months down the road, the script is sold and they cast Christopher Walken. So what happens then? All my work and all the syncopation of my words gets thrown out the window because the actor is someone who just doesn't play.
By the way, I've never bought into that whole thing of not including unnecessary stuff in your screenplay. Every screenplay teacher will tell you that. Every book on screenplay writing. But time and time and time again, when I read people's screenplays, they're all over the map. Screenplays that have been written. Some people do that. Black room, night. They speak in these half sentences, and it's all about blah, 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 blah. And then there's other people who write something that is beautiful. You can read the screenplay almost like you're reading a book.
Right. Pick up any script by George Romero, and then pick up a script by Walter Hill. Vastly different.
Yeah.
Vastly different.
Going back to Tarantino, look at his scripts. They're. I think that whole thing is bullshit about, don't say somebody is beautiful, right? Because beauty, be more literal. Mm-hmm. Say they have green eyes, say they have this. Okay, that's very cool. I get that. But if it's being filtered through other people's hands anyways, I might as well just say so-and-so's very beautiful.
Right.
You know what? You get what I'm saying? Because they may think green eyes, look like shit.
Low Pan doesn't.
Yeah, well, low pan is low pan.
But the idea, I think, is that a friend of mine who is teaches screenwriting, and I have talked many times, and it's like the idea that your job is to give, as screenwriter, is to give just enough information that sort of implies the tone or the theme in the room, but also moves everything forward. You don't have to worry, like as a fiction writer, I have to worry about everything. I have to worry about the color of the drapes, I have to worry about the color of the carpeting, what's on the desk. And I have to at least consider it because I may have to need it, I may need to add it or whatever. But as a screenwriter, none of that matters. That's what your art department and your set design department's for. They'll take care of it. Your job is to strip it down to just what needs to happen on the page so that someone could follow the line of your story. Because even then, your director is going to come in and he's going to put his spin on the ball. He's going to say, well, this doesn't speak to me, but we're going to change this. Or, he's going to make his changes, right? Everyone puts their stink on it. But with fiction, the reason why I like fiction is that I'm God. I control literally everything. And I don't have to rely on someone who, I know I can describe my monster adequately. I don't need to rely on someone else who may or may not deliver something that I'm happy with.
How often have we seen, or heard a scriptwriter say, they destroyed it. They took my baby and they destroyed it.
In fact, screenwriter is the last person anyone wants to see on a set.
Right. He's despite the fact that the idea generates with him, and if it wasn't for him, he wouldn't have that idea. He's like one of the lowest men on the totem pole. He gets the least respect.
They'll keep him around. They'll keep him in town. They'll keep him at a hotel offset or whatever in case they need someone that can sort of write them out of a corner.
Some directors,
some will,
rarely, but some directors
some don't want
them
any
there
part of it,
so that if they run into a bump, they can say, "Hey, what about this?" And the screenwriter's like, "Oh yeah, well he drives this car."
Right.
Right. But not,
what are the rules that we've heard for writing and writing screenplays that we just have to stop and get off the table, that you feel that people rely too much on, and it's not helping anybody out, and it's not helping the marketplace or the industry out?
Well, I think that, like, I just don't see, as far as fiction goes, I don't read a lot of writers that have, again, it's that philosophy. They're not trying to say anything. My book is out and it's all zombies and blah, 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 blah. But I look at other zombie literature and I wonder, well, this is more of the same. This is Night of the Living Dead again and again and again and again. Why aren't we trying to do something different with it? I think the reason why the zombie cycle is running itself out is because no one's doing anything different with it. It's the same way a few years ago the vampire thing ran its course, is because after a while everything started reading like someone transcribed a Vampire the Masquerade game. You know, that's essentially what all of the Underworld films are, is just a Vampire the Masquerade game. So I just wanted people to return to being able to tell me a story and put some thought into it. You know what I mean? There's nothing worse than having, the magic thing that appears in the last minute that saves the day, or that thing that you forgot about that we mentioned briefly back in scene 24 now suddenly is going to save the day. It's like, it's purposely confusing, and it doesn't have anything to really say thematically.
I think, in reference to your question about what we take away, in my opinion, it's really just about format. I think that as far as storytelling rules, they're all solid. I think people need to go back to them. I think that people are ignoring them. And then, once you've got that, then don't be a slave to it. But you have to have it first, right? There's, you got a block of granite, and there's a beautiful sculpture waiting in there, and you just got to hack away at the parts that you don't need. But without that block of granite, without that foundation, then you've got nothing. So
right.
I do think that one thing that's missing in general when it comes to screenplays is people are forgetting one of Aristotle's 7 elements of storytelling, and that is the theme or the idea. And I think that Tom's been talking to that. What is your story about? It's about this guy fighting this monster. No. What is it really about? Is it about friendship? Is it about love? Is it about... And I think that's what a lot of things are lacking, is I think people are not thinking about the deeper things that their story's really about, or should be.
And you think that comes first or second when people are creating their writing? Because I know when I would write my noir, it would always come from a concept that I would see in the world, and sort of then that gets fleshed out in a narrative. Do you think it could work the other way around, that you have a premise and then you're able to find the concept? Because, Tom, you're sort of talking about that's where these films are falling short, is that we have a great premise, it's high concept filmmaking, which started around the Star Wars time. How do you cram in ideas?
I don't know. There are people out there that quote unquote write to market, and I don't know how they do it. You know what I mean? Like they go through Duotrope, or they go through these other sites that let you know who's buying what fiction, and they go, oh, hey, so-and-so is doing a werewolf anthology. I'm going to take a week or a few days or whatever and crank out a werewolf story and send it to them in the hopes that they'll buy it. I don't know how people do that. I can't do that. I won't even try, just because I don't think that way. I have to be excited. If I'm not excited and amused by something, I can't.
I think, of course, it can work both ways. You may have an idea about, because of something that you're feeling, or you're at some point in your life, I really want to write about parenthood. Now, what that form that's going to take, I don't know yet, but I know that that's the genesis. That's what's got me. That's what's got me thinking. Or it might be, I want to write this funny story about that my kid did the other day, and then it starts to morph into this bigger thing about parenthood.
Right.
And so I think it totally can work either way.
But we should be conscious that these type of stories have an overarching concept.
They should.
While we're moving towards them.
I think they should. Otherwise, you just start. I mean, yeah, things happen in the Friday the 13th series, but I just don't see an overarching sort of theme there. After a while, it just became about, hey, they want another one. Let's do it. Let's crank it out. Let's do another one. And I'm not picking just on Friday the 13th, but it's not like a however many there are. I don't even know anymore.
It has to be more than what new inventive way can we think of killing somebody.
Isn't that what the Saw films have become?
Kind of.
Just, hey, we thought of this other cool way.
Well, I've only seen the first one. I know the third one was very conceptual for the time because it was about the healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
So they said it happened unconsciously because it came out right when the healthcare debates happened in America, and
Right.
it's one of the series that it's very politically savvy and very much in depth. Again, I haven't watched it because I'm probably watching TerrorVision, which also has
Right.
watched this concept for the 12th time.
Well, you know, for
I
me,
guess those are different sort of films because, like, I'll always love Ghoulies 2, but I think if I wanted to talk about a concept around Ghoulies 2, it's just sort of the mischievous love of little monsters and how do you play with that. It's like those films that are very simplistic are me almost like music. It's like I have a note, and how many different ways can I play that note through 90 minutes?
but I think that there's a deeper thematic going on. I can't believe I'm saying this with Goonies. Where, I mean, maybe it's friendship, maybe it's like, hey, you should be nice to your siblings. Or I barely remember the film, to be honest.
I like to think about Ghoulies being about friendship because they're probably friends with each other.
Maybe.
The same with Spookies and Munchies and Gremlins.
Yeah, maybe.
I think that when it comes to that type of stuff and that type of movie, I hate to cite, one of the guys that I see as the architect of much of what's wrong with film today, but Spielberg, I think, had a handle on it because he gave you spectacle, right? He definitely had the exploitive element there. But he also was really good at just telling the story. He was really good at that 3-act narrative. He was really good at a theme that, something that's underwriting the whole thing. So it wasn't just about a monster. It wasn't just about this. It was always something to do with a character, or it was something about a concept, whether that concept is friendship, whether that concept is responsibility, whatever it might be. And I think that might be, for me, it's all about old school storytelling. That's going to always be what touches me the most. And I watched Wizard of Oz the other night, of all things, and I just caught myself a couple of times going, why don't people make movies like this anymore?
I think audiences want something. The thing that's, I hear you on that. I'll sign on for just about anything. I mean, I signed on for 5.5 hours of Redcliffe. So, but at the end of the day, I have to feel like you had a point to make and you made it. You made me think about things that I didn't. And there are some films that are that use alternative structures that sort of work. I mean, look at Sayadian's Caligula, not Caligula, Caligari. The reboot of Dr.
Right.
Caligari.
In the 90s?
Yeah,
I love it.
I do too. But it's definitely non-traditional, non-linear sort of storytelling. But at the end of the day, you feel like you got it. Made you consider, at least, if nothing else, structure a little differently.
Well, something like Forbidden Zone is the same way.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
There was talk. about remaking it at some point.
That was getting kicked around for a while.
Heather cracks her neck.
It's just so perfect the way it is.
I just don't get it. That's one of the things. We can do a whole show about that, but I just don't get that.
That'd be a fun show, just a show of shit we don't get.
So I guess the question is as we're winding up, we're coming up close on 90 minutes. Is there someone out there that you think that's getting it right?
Justin Benson. I like his work. He wrote Resolution with Alan, his partner, and Spring. I mentioned him, I think, in last episode. I think those guys from a genre perspective are doing right. See, the characters are incredibly realistic. They're wonderful to listen to. And the stories are there, but again, because we're working on such an independent level, you don't have the vastness of something that Spielberg tried to work with in the 80s. Mm-hmm. But I found watching those two films, it's like, this is incredibly great writing and almost literate writing from their work.
Okay. You?
No. No.
Yeah,
I don't.
Who should we look to then when we're reading screenplays? Old school, OG.
Well, I mean, well, I do want to say that I think, like, I'm a personal fan of the way that you can go through with, like, Alex de la Iglesias stuff. It's madcap and it's wild, but at least there's a heart there, and he seems to be able to spin a lot of plates and keep.
He is great, as is Almodovar as a writer. Is someone else who can write anything, and I am not a fan of romantic comedies or people together singing and dancing, but anything he does, for some reason, is incredibly engaging, and mostly from a character perspective and a casting perspective, because I don't care what those characters do. I just want to listen to them.
Mm-hmm. You?
I don't think we should be reading. If it comes to movies, if we're talking about movies, I don't want to read the fucking screenplay. I want to watch the movie.
Yeah, I'm not that guy either.
Yeah, if I want to learn something about writing a screenplay, then I'll check out some of the screenplays. But I mean, like, as an example, to kind of, to point to good storytelling, I'm not going to tell anybody to read a screenplay. I'm going to say, watch the movie.
I mean, like, for me, there's stuff like, God, Jacques Tournier's Out of the Past is just a greatly constructed. Look at the construction of Fincher's Seven, script-wise.
Amazing. I've never read Seven, but yes, that's an interesting film because it's so influential from a structural standpoint and visually, but was influential like a decade after it came out. Yeah. We're still living in post-Seven times.
Look at, I mean, just the idea that the moment where the audience becomes complicit. Look at the aha moment in Fight Club. Look at the aha moment in Sixth Sense. The audience is now completely complicit, and they've sort of signed on to everything that this person's talking about, and then that person. I think there's nothing better than being in a room with a director who doesn't have your best interest at heart. That really wants to hurt you and make you think and rub your nose in the aspects of life that you probably don't want to hear. It's why I think Aftermath is such a beautiful film. Yeah.
I think for a traditional storytelling narrative, I think everybody can learn something from checking out Silence of the Lambs.
Sure.
It's a basic mystery. It's a crime story. I mean, all the elements are there that you would find in a movie from the 40s or the 50s, for example. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good example to follow.
Right on. Okay, we're at about 90 minutes now, so I guess we're done. Yeah.
I think so.
I mean, this is the type of subject that you could have a podcast, and I'm sure there are, on storytelling.
Yeah.
Where every week you talk.
I know
about
Screenwriting
something.
Magazine has one out.
Right.
That's quite good. And,
Well,
and
what we can say to our folks out there is that if they felt that they've learned a lot or wanted to learn more, we can certainly ask for their feedback to go back onto these subjects.
Or if you think we're full of shit, any of us.
yeah,
Yes, if you think Langley's a little fuddy-duddy, please tweet that.
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
I also wanted to bring up that in 2 weeks we'll have our first guest on the bonus material podcast, and that's going to be Shannon John Shea, who is as he'll tell you, is not a makeup artist but a creature maker, and he's worked on everything from Evil Dead 2 to Men in Black 3 and everything in between. So, and he's doing a lot of other cool stuff now that we'll be talking about. So be sure to check that out.
Yeah,
I can't even contain my excitement.
Yeah, it's going to be great. And then next week we're not even sure yet what we're going to talk about. But
rest assured, it's going to be awesome.
it will be awesome.
Tom, do you wanna wrap it up?
Yeah. I talk a lot both here and on the blog about films that I don't like, and what we've been talking about tonight is pretty much all of the reasons why I don't like a lot of modern cinema. And I'm really hard on things because, as someone who writes himself, I can see when people are using tricks and stuff, and when they ultimately don't have anything to say, which is a real problem for me, because I feel like if you don't have something to say, you're either going to artistically wow me, visually in film, or you're just wasting my time. So, but it's important. Again, if I have one message, it's you got to say something. You got to say something that makes me reconsider my situation. Otherwise, again, you're just spinning your wheels.
I would like to end with a question for everybody listening. If you want, think of it as a trivia question. See if you guys can tell me who said this. Stories don't have a middle or an end anymore. They usually have a beginning that never stops beginning. Who said that? Let us know.
Wow. All right. A puzzler.
A puzzler. Check it out on the puzzler.
That's the end of episode 13, the bonus material podcast. I'm Heather.
I'm Tom.
And I'm Langley.
Have a great evening or afternoon.
Toodles.
Bye.
This has been a Filmways presentation, darling.